Hello, my name is Mike Schmidtke, and I'm a fishery scientist with the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. In this presentation, I'll be discussing Regulatory Amendment 36 to the Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan, which considers changes to recreational vessel limits for gag and black grouper, as well as other regulatory changes to accommodate the use of on-demand gear in the commercial black sea bass pot fishery. Before we get into the amendment itself, I'll go over some housekeeping for the presentation and comment process that will be part of the public scoping webinars on February 12th and 13th. First, I will review the amendment as developed to this point. Next, I'll pause to answer some clarifying questions about the amendment. And finally, a council member will chair the comment portion of the meeting, calling on those who attend the webinars and want to provide verbal comments. The South Atlantic Council is one of 8 regional management councils that are responsible for managing fisheries in the U.S. exclusive economic zone, which ranges from 3 to 200 miles offshore. The South Atlantic Council is responsible for EEZ waters off North Carolina through the Florida Keys. Council members include recreational and commercial fishery stakeholders, state marine agency representatives, and federal agency representatives. The 13 voting members include the Marine Agency representative from each state in the region, 2 citizen representatives from each state, and the Southeast Regional Administrator of NOAA Fisheries. The Council's role in the management process is to develop management plans for South Atlantic fisheries and recommend regulations to NOAA Fisheries. NOAA Fisheries considers Council recommendations and implements fishery regulations for federal waters. Regulatory Amendment 36 is being developed to address 2 main issues. The first issue involves gag and black grouper recreational vessel limits. Through Snapper Grouper Amendment 53, recreational vessel limits were established for gag and black grouper as 2 gag and 2 black grouper per vessel per day or trip for the private and for-hire components, respectively. These limits went into place in October of 2023. However, during the amendment development process, the Council intended for the recreational vessel limit for these species to be an aggregate limit, meaning 2 fish of either gag or black grouper could be retained per vessel per day or trip. An aggregate vessel limit aligns with the recreational bag limit that has been in place since before Amendment 53, which is an aggregate limit of 1 gag or black grouper per person per day. An aggregate vessel limit would also better align with Council efforts to rebuild the gag stock, which is currently overfished. So, one action in the amendment will consider changes to those recreational vessel limits. The second issue being addressed through Regulatory Amendment 36 is accommodating the use of on-demand gear in the commercial black sea bass pot fishery. On-demand, also known as ropeless, pots are black sea bass pots that are fished without a vertical line remaining in the water column. Removal of the vertical line lessens the risk of whale entanglements, which have become of particular concern along the U.S. Atlantic coast due to the decline of North Atlantic right whales and documented interactions with fishing and boating activities. Instead of a vertical line in the water column, the retrieval mechanism for on-demand gear is stored with the pot on the bottom. Several on-demand retrieval systems have been developed, including versions with a rope and buoy that is just tied down to the pot and released via remote control or on a timer, as well as other versions that do not use a vertical line at all, instead using mechanisms like inflatables to bring the pot to the surface. A variety of on-demand pot configurations have been experimentally used in the black sea bass commercial fishery since 2021 under an exempted fishing permit, which expires in April of 2025. A workshop reviewed preliminary results of the EFP study in August 2023. Results indicate that on-demand pots were effective at catching black sea bass while also reducing the probability of whale entanglements. Expanded use of on-demand gear in the greater black sea bass pot fishery was also supported by the commercial fishermen that tested the gear in the EFP study. With the feedback from the fishermen, preliminary results of the study, and the upcoming expiration of the EFP, the Council is considering actions necessary to accommodate the use of on-demand gear in the times and areas where roped pots are currently allowed. Black sea bass pots are subject to several regulations under both the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act as well as the Marine Mammal Protection Act. With respect to many of these regulations, on-demand pots may already be allowable. However, Council and NOAA Fisheries staff are doing our due diligence by examining these regulations and consulting with General Counsel on how these regulations can be interpreted in the context of on-demand pots. These discussions are still ongoing. If changes to the Magnuson-Stevens Act are necessary to make on-demand pot usage allowable or practical, the Council will consider these changes through actions in Regulatory Amendment 36. One potential change that has been identified to this point and will be discussed further in the information requested by the Council involves stowage requirements for gear while transiting through special management zones and marine protected areas. As a brief aside, I noted earlier that this amendment is only considering accommodations for on-demand gear in areas and times when roped gear is allowed. Under the EFP study, on-demand pots are allowed to be fished in nearshore areas that are seasonally closed due to whale migration patterns. Regulatory Amendment 36 is not considering opening this closed area in the long-term fishery. A stock assessment of black sea bass, CDAR 76, was recently completed. The Council is currently awaiting catch level recommendations based on that assessment. Once they have those, work will begin on Snapper Grouper Amendment 56, which will address any management actions that deal with changes to catch or effort in response to that assessment. Amendment 56 is where consideration of changes to the closed areas could occur. Here we see the projected timeline for Regulatory Amendment 36. We are currently in the scoping step of this process. Through scoping, we incorporate public input to help the Council determine what actions and alternatives need to be included in the amendment, and also to inform staff of what information is available to help inform the Council's decisions. After scoping, the Council will give staff directions on how they want the amendment to be drafted. After the amendment is drafted, we'll come back out for another set of meetings and comment period to allow public input on which of the alternatives that are being considered should be the Council's preferred choices of action. The intent of this timeline is to have regulatory changes effective before the expiration of the EFP that allows use of on-demand gear. Over the next 2 slides, I'll show some questions that the Council is seeking feedback on. These may not encompass all ideas related to Regulatory Amendment 36, but they include some of the questions that have come up for the Council or from staff as we've developed the amendment to this point. First, should the Council establish an aggregate recreational vessel limit of 2 gag or black grouper per vessel per day or trip? As a reminder, the current regulations allow 2 gag per vessel and 2 black grouper per vessel, subject to an aggregate bag limit of 1 gag or black grouper per person. Next, what types of on-demand black sea bass gear should be allowed and are likely to be used? In preliminary examination of regulations, we found that less regulatory change may be necessary to accommodate the use of on-demand gear that uses a vertical line and buoy, because these materials can be marked and identified similarly to roped gear. They would just be storing the rope and buoy at depth until retrieval. To accommodate a wider variety of on-demand gears, more regulatory changes may be necessary. However, the Council is interested in knowing if the effort is put in to accommodate on-demand gears that don't use a vertical line and buoy, would fishermen even use those? Is there desire from the fishery to use those gears that would make such a workload investment worthwhile? Finally, And this big question has several sub-questions. How should on-demand pot users indicate pots are not being fished while transiting through marine protected areas and special management zones? The current requirement for roped gear is that the buoy be detached when transiting these areas. From preliminary conversations with some of the commercial fishermen that participated in the EFP project, removing the buoy from on-demand gear may be more difficult than for roped gear and an overly burdensome requirement. An alternative that has been discussed is to align the indicator of non-fishing while transiting MPAs and SMZs to be the same as while transiting the seasonal closed areas. While transiting the seasonal closed areas, the pot can be stowed on deck with the buoy detached or with the buoy stowed within the pot. EFP project participants indicated this may be a more feasible alternative for on-demand gear users. So, with this context, the Council is asking the public, for on-demand gear with a rope and buoy, is it practical to require that the buoy be detached, attached but stowed within the pot, or stowed in some other way? To help us evaluate and compare potential effects of one alternative versus another, the Council also needs to know, would disconnecting the buoy from an on-demand pot take significant time away from fishing? If so, about how much? We don't really have data to indicate economic effects of one gear stowage requirement versus another, so public input in this respect could be quite valuable to give the Council some basis for comparing these options. Lastly, for on-demand gear without a rope and buoy, what are some potential stowage requirements that could indicate the gear is not being fished while transiting through MPAs and SMZs? Requirements on the books are written for roped pots, but similar to these, pots that have no rope or buoy at all may need to have some indicator that they aren't being used while stowed on deck to allow for proper enforcement of these area restrictions. The Council accepts comments via several avenues. Verbal comments can be provided at scoping webinars held on February 12th and 13th at 6 p.m. Written comments can be submitted online using the Regulatory Amendment 36 comment form on the Council's website. Written comments can also be submitted via mail or fax using the information shown on the screen. All comments must be submitted by 5 p.m. on Friday, February 16th, 2024. If you have any questions about the amendment, you can contact me, Mike Schmidtke, using the information shown on the bottom left. This concludes the recorded presentation. Thank you for your time, attention, and interest in South Atlantic Council Fisheries Management.